So what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at some relationships between special pairs of angles. So I want you to go ahead and pause the video and complete the warm-up and see if you can identify each of these types of angles in the picture that is over to the right. So go ahead and pause the video. Alright, so if we wanted to name a pair of vertical angles, an example of a vertical angle in this problem would be JAE, so angle JAE, and angle BAK, angle BAK. And remember, vertical angles are two angles that are sharing a vertex that are across from each other that are created by two intersecting lines. A linear pair are going to be a collinear angles that are sharing a vertex and a ray coming from the same line. So an example of this could be angle BAK and angle BAJ. They're sharing the same vertex and they both share the ray BA. Complementary angles, remember, are going to be angles that add up to 90 degrees. So to find two angles that add up to 90 degrees, we would notice that there is a red square in the corner of the angle DAE. So if we take DAJ and JAE, those would be two angles that add up to 90 degrees. And finally, supplementary, remember that's going to be 180 degrees. So two angles that would be supplementary that would add up to 180 degrees, we could have BAH, angle BAH, and angle HAE. Okay, and again, there are more than one answer to each of these, but those are just the ones that I came up with right off the bat. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at two different investigations today. We're going to go ahead and we're going to use some inductive reasoning to come up with a conjecture, and then with one of these we are going to prove the conjecture using deductive reasoning. So the first investigation requires us to look at this picture of this linear pair over here, angles SRP and SRQ. Those are linear angles. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at something called the linear pair conjecture. So if we were to take a protractor and measure both of these angles over here, we would find out that angle SRP is equal to 40 degrees, and we would find out that angle SRQ is equal to 140 degrees. So what do you notice about the measure of these, or about the sum of the measures of these linear pair angles? So hopefully you will have noticed that they add up to 180 degrees. And so what you will have noticed if we were doing this in class is everyone would draw their own angles that were linear pairs. They would measure them, and then you would find out that everyone's angles should come back to be about 180 degrees. So does everyone make the same observation? Yes. So what we can say is for the linear pair conjecture, we could say if two angles form a linear pair, then their sums are 180 degrees. Another way that you could say that is then they are supplementary. Okay, so and so what we notice here and what we find is that regardless of what linear pair you have, those two angles are always going to add up to 180 degrees. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at a relationship between vertical angles, and some of us may have known this already, but what I want you to do is draw two intersecting lines, and you know, since we are doing this in a video, we're not necessarily going to do this all the way through, but what I want you to see is that if you look at these two pictures that we have drawn over here, I want you to label which ones are vertical angles. So if you look at this, both of these angles, you have vertical angles are angle 1 and angle 3 and angle 2 and angle 4. So in both of these are vertical angles. Again, vertical angles are two angles that are formed by intersecting lines that share a vertex. So 2 and 4 share a vertex, 1 and 3 share a vertex. The important distinguishing feature of vertical angles is that they do not share sides. So what we would go ahead and do is we would draw these vertical angles on a piece of paper, and then we'd fold the paper in half so that the vertical angles lie on top of each other. And what you would notice about these vertical angles is that they are equal. Okay, so the vertical angles, and we're going to abbreviate vertical. No, we won't abbreviate it because vertical angles are congruent. They are the same size. Okay, and if you folded this so angles 1 and 3 laid on top of each other, you would see that 1 and 3 are congruent. If you folded it so that angle 2 and 4 were laying on top of each other, you would notice that they are both congruent. So what do we notice about their measures? We notice that they are the same. Okay, their measures are the same. So what we're able to do here is we are able to take these observations, and again, we would have every student in the class do this, and we would find that regardless of what vertical angles each student drew, every time the angles were going to be congruent. They'd be the same size when they lay on top of each other. So the conjecture that we can come up with here for vertical angles is that if two angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. Okay. Now, we've talked about this before, and we kind of accept this as true, but what we're going to do is we're going to use some deductive reasoning to come up with a reason as to why vertical angles are true, or why vertical angles are congruent. So what we would do here is we have to use something else that we know is true. So in this case, it tells you to use the linear pair conjecture and the diagram at the right to write a deductive argument explaining why angle 1 must be congruent to angle 3. So it tells us that we are using the linear pair conjecture. And remember, the linear pair conjecture tells us that a linear pair of angles is supplementary, adds up to 180 degrees. So let's start by figuring out where are our linear pairs. Our linear pairs here are angle 2 and angle 1 and angle 3 and angle 4. Okay, so we know that if we were to take the measures of angle 2 and angle 1, they add up to 180 degrees. If we take the measures of angles 3 and 4, they add up to 180 degrees. So measure of angle 2 and measure of angle 1 equals 180. Measure of angle 3 and measure of angle 4 equals 180. So let's write that a little bit more mathematically. So we know angle 2 and angle 1 add up to 180. We know angle 3 and angle 4 add up to 180. So that means that their sums are equal. So what we can say is the measure of angle 2 plus the measure of angle 1 is equal to the measure of angle 3 and plus the measure of angle 4. And remember, what we're trying to do is we're trying to show why angle 1 and angle 3 are congruent. Why are vertical angles congruent here? Well, what we're able to do then is we can go ahead and let's see. So what we have here is we're actually let's backtrack here. So what we want to do is we want to get this expression to say that angle 1 equals angle 3. And so what I notice here is I would like to subtract the measure of angle 2. Okay? So what I would need is, instead of having the measure of angle 4, I would need to replace the measure of angle 4 with another angle that is still makes this true. So what we can notice is, we notice that angle 3 and angle 2 also are linear pairs. So what we can do is, we can go ahead and take angle 4 and replace it with angle 2, because this is still a true statement. Because we can say that measure of angle 3 and the measure of angle 2 is also 180 degrees. So now we can subtract the measure of angle 2. Those cancel, and we have the measurement of angle 1 is equal to the measurement of angle 3, which is what we wanted to show. And it shows that those two angles, angle 3 and angle 1, which are vertical angles, are equal. And so this is a way for us to prove, using deductive reasoning, that our vertical angles conjecture is true. All right. So one thing that we need to talk about is, we figured out that vertical angles, we figured out the vertical angle conjecture states, if two angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. And what we want to talk about now is, does that also mean that all congruent angles are vertical? So we have this thing that's called the converse. The converse of an if-then statement switches the if and the then parts. So the converse of the vertical angles conjecture would be stated as, if two angles are congruent, then they are vertical angles. Okay, so again, you switch the if and the then. So the vertical angles conjecture says, if two angles are vertical angles, then they are congruent. Switching it would say, if two angles are congruent, then they are vertical angles. Is this true? And a quick counterexample of that is, no. If I draw two congruent angles like these ones that you see right here, they are congruent based on the markings that we have put on them, but they are not vertical angles. They do not share a vertex, and they are not created by two intersecting lines. So therefore, the converse of the vertical angles conjecture is false. Okay? So what I want to look at here are these two questions that are summaries of what we have talked about today. So first of all, are all mathematical conjectures accepted as true? The answer for this is not until they've been proved using deductive reasoning. Okay, so you have to prove these before you can accept them as true. So not until they have been proved using deductive reasoning. Hey.
Okay.
I'm recording real quick. I'm done video. Deductive reasoning. And then what kind of reasoning led to the conjectures? The conjectures that we are making, we are coming up with those using observations that we have seen. So this would be inductive reasoning, whenever we are using observations to come up with our conjectures. Okay? And the last two things that I want to look at are these two extra examples. We have one question here that says, what's wrong with this picture? So if we look at this picture, we want to figure out, there's something wrong with it. What is it? Well, if we look at this picture, what we can see is that this angle right here and this angle right here are vertical angles, so that this is 91 degrees. Now, we know that when we have a straight line right here, that these angles should sum up to 180 degrees. So if we check this, 29 plus 91 plus 59, what we find out is that really gives us 179 degrees. So using what we know about vertical angles, we're able to figure out that those labels aren't correct, because it comes up 1 degree short from what it needs to be. And then finally, over here, if we want to solve for x, we have a number of ways that we can do this. So we could use what we learned about the linear pair conjectures, and we could also use what we know about vertical angles. So I'm going to go ahead and use what we know about vertical angles. We know that vertical angles are congruent. So if we take 216 minus 2x equals 3x plus 16, we find that, we set them equal to each other because of the vertical angles conjecture. And then we're going to solve for x. We add 2x to both sides. We get 216 equals 5x plus 16. We subtract 16. We get 5x equals 200. Divide by 5. We get x equals 40. And so that's how we solve for x. Okay, so you guys are going to go ahead and work on your homework right here. And then if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.